Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of the Raccoon Club podcast. I had just finished recording episode 3, and I was heading down to the office to do some audio editing, and a buddy of mine texted. We were talking that morning about Trump, and I texted him back and I said, I bet you by the time I get to the office, Trump is going to say or do something that I'm going to have to do a podcast on. And the funny thing is, I live only 10 minutes away from my office. And when I get to the office, I turn on the TV, and lo and behold, President Trump is dousing himself with gasoline and lighting himself on fire on national television. If you don't know what I'm talking about, today supposedly was Infrastructure Day for the president. He was supposed to be talking about all the great things he's going to be doing with infrastructure and all the great things he's going to be building, and et cetera, et cetera. And a reporter asked him about the Charlottesville riots. And he lost his fucking mind and went off on a rant that I can't even begin to make sense on. The Charlottesville riots was a Unite the Right event by the alt-right and by neo-Nazis, an event that led to the death of a young woman when she was run over by one of those said white supremacists and Nazis. And Donald Trump today, when asked about it, got defensive because if you remember on Friday, a couple days ago, he gave a sort of a really weak ass response when commenting on it. He didn't really mention white supremacy. He didn't want to mention the Nazis. He basically said, well, something bad happened and yada, yada. And then he was pressured into giving a speech the day afterwards with much stronger language. And if you watched it, he had this look on his face when he finished that was sort of like, okay, fine, I did it. Get off my back. Like it was one of those speeches. So today he's asked this question and he loses it. And he goes off and he pretends that there were two sides to these riots. He invented an entire political wing now called the alt-left, which never existed. And he blamed the supposed fictional, completely made up alt-left for some of the violence. He equated the Confederate traitor General Lee to George Washington because they were both slave owners. And we'll talk about that in a second, because false equivalency is something that the conservatives do extraordinarily well. The GOP does extraordinarily well. And Donald Trump, I've noticed when he's backed into a corner, falls onto false equivalency all the time to try and get himself out of a jam. So if you watched it, it was an extraordinary sight because these media events are very carefully structured and they're very carefully controlled. No sooner had he finished his prepared remarks than he went off the rails. And if you look at some of the photos of his staff, his new chief of staff, General Kelly, the look on their face was like they were watching a car crash into a wall in slow motion, because they all knew that whatever messaging they had planned for this week had gone completely out the window because Donald Trump just went insane. Some of the things that Donald Trump claimed today was that not everyone at the rally was a white supremacist. After you listen to this podcast, do yourself a favor and go and Google Vice Charlottesville, because the great guys, the great reporters at Vice were actually embedded with these white supremacists, with these alt-right guys, with these neo-Nazis at the Charlottesville event. And I challenge you to find me one person in that group that is not a white supremacist. These people hate the Jews. These people hate blacks. These people hate Ivanka Trump's husband, Jared Kushner, because he's Jewish. They ran around screaming blood and soil. And if you're not familiar with that term, that is a Nazi term that was used to sort of inspire Nazis to fight for the homeland. They ran around screaming something to the effect, if I'm not mistaken, of the Jews will not replace me. And Donald Trump supposedly doesn't think that most of them or many of them were white supremacists. He believed that the taking down of the statue of the traitor, again, Confederate traitor, General Lee, was a, quote, slippery slope, because somehow if you take down statues of Confederate generals, that means you're going to start taking down statues of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Again, an absolutely insane thing for the president of the United States to say. And I felt that I had to do a podcast because by the time I got back home, it actually got worse. It started to metastasize. One of the things I've always told people about Donald Trump is that as entertaining as I find him, because I find him kind of buffoonish and I think he's way out of his league, What's really interesting is watching the establishment GOP twist themselves in knots in terms of how to respond to what he says. Because one of the operating theories that I have about the GOP is that they will put up with Trump as long as it takes for him to pass a tax cut, because they don't want anything getting in the way of that tax cut. So you heard today Marco Rubio and a lot of John Kasich and a lot of the prominent Republicans sort of come out today and say things like, you know what, there's no false equivalency. These neo-Nazis are bad. White supremacy is bad. But none of them criticized the president directly. None of them said, dude, you've really crossed a line here that we can't follow you beyond. The presidency is not an emperorship that he can be removed from office at any point in time. The Constitution creates that failsafe there. So it always stuns me that conservatives refuse to do that when it is screamingly obvious that what that country needs right now is for President Trump to simply be removed from office. I'm not talking about assassinations. I'm not talking about anything violent. I'm not talking about a revolution. There's a mechanism within the Constitution where the House of Representatives can get together and say, you know what? Enough is enough. You're just not cut out for this job. Thanks for coming out. Vice President Pence is now the President of the United States. It's really simple. But they won't do it. I don't think they'll do it for a very long time, if ever. Number one, because I think conservatives talk a tough game, but they're really cowards. They're really afraid of actually putting their money where their mouth is. But number two, because I think they know what would happen. If you remove President Trump from office, it creates the kind of political firestorm that will prevent you from getting anything done. And they are really, really, really dying for their upper class tax cut. But what this really illustrated for me, what's happening in the way the conservatives are responding, really highlights exactly what white supremacy is. And that's what I want to talk about in this podcast. Not Donald Trump, because believe it or not, as entertaining as he is, he's usually the least interesting thing that's going on in politics. It's the ripple effects of what he does that I find fascinating. So immediately after this, you saw two things. Number one, you saw conservatives not throw him under the bus and not say enough is enough. You've got to go. You've crossed a line that if Obama ever got near, we would have thrown him in jail over. And you also saw conservative media, for the most part, play into the equivalency thing and really highlight what white supremacy is. So I was watching when I got home. Of course, I wanted to turn on the news to see if he said anything else stupid. And a show called Erin Burnett Out on Front was on CNN. And she had a dude on who was a conservative commentator and obviously one of Trump's lackeys, who went out of his way to pretend that he was condemning white supremacists, but then went right along with the whole false equivalency thing of saying, well, you know, there were other protesters there. And, you know, what about Black Lives Matter? That is white supremacy. White supremacy is the idea that when a white person makes a mistake, especially if it's a white person from your tribe, so from your conservative wing, there's a million reasons why that person made that mistake. Never mind the fact that a lot of the white supremacists were carrying weapons. Virginia is an open carry state, but many of those white supremacists were actually pointing weapons at protesters, at other protesters. He then went on to really highlight to me the reason why African Americans must be so incensed at things. And again, I do not speak on behalf of African Americans. I think that's actually part of the problem of white supremacy and part of the problem of white privilege. At the end of what I thought was an insane interview with that white conservative gentleman, that guy who, again, tried to equivocate between neo-Nazis and Black Lives Matter, a guy who actually said the following thing. He said, you know, all these alt-left people are essentially preventing us from having a conversation. Again, only if you come from a position of white supremacy do you believe that the civil rights of others is part of a conversation. Only if you come from a position of white supremacy do you believe that statues dedicated to traitors to the United States should still be kept up because they're part of some sort of perverse historical respect that white supremacists have. We've come to believe that white supremacy is about burning crosses, is about Nazi flags. It's not about that. It's about the way that I think many white people, not all white people, but many white people have come to become so comfortable with the fact that they are at the center of the political, economic, and social life in America, that anything that threatens them sets them off. So the alt-rights and conservative media's obsession with Black Lives Matter, I've always found really fascinating. Black Lives Matter at its foundation is a political and social movement that believes that black youth, in particular black men, should not be shot by the police without reason. A perfectly reasonable political statement, if you ask me. But because of the name Black Lives Matter, white people lost their fucking minds because they thought that what that meant was that white lives doesn't matter. And if you talk to any Black Lives Matter activist, they will tell you that's not at all what it means. What it means is that Black lives matter. When a black individual is oppressed by the state, is shot by a cop, is falsely arrested, that person's life has intrinsic value and has intrinsic meaning, and their lives matter, and that we as a society should be stepping up and figuring out, why did this happen, and what can we do to prevent it from happening again? It's really straightforward. It doesn't mean that white people don't matter. It means that white people's lives have mattered so much, it's overshadowed everyone else. So maybe it's time for us to recognize that other lives matter. In this particular case, Black lives matter, because they're the ones who are being disproportionately assaulted by police officers, disproportionately thrown in jail, disproportionately punished in a radically racist judicial process that has historically shown, statistically shown, that if you are an African American, you are more likely than not to get a much more harsher prison sentence, to get a much higher bail setting, to be essentially screwed over by the judicial system and by the police system. On Fox News last night, Tucker Carlson goes on and goes throughout all the people in history that owned slaves. I think he said Muhammad owned slaves, Aristotle owned slaves. And again, it's this insanity. What is with the conservative movement? GOP has a white supremacist problem. It's had it for years now, and it's bubbling to the surface in the most unbelievable way. And what's happening right now is that the real test of courage for conservatives and for the GOP as a party is, are they going to acknowledge that this is a thing that's happening, that this is a cancer that's growing within their movement and within their party? Or are they going to keep doing what I've been watching political commentators on TV do for the last 24 hours, which is once again try and blame Black Lives Matter for something. Once again, invent something called the alt-left. Once again, say, well, there are both sides involved. Once again, pretend and go back to this laughable argument that, it was Democrats that supported slavery hundreds of years ago. That's all irrelevant. If you look at the electoral map, especially the federal one in terms of House of Representatives, in terms of senators, the GOP is a Southern white party. How do you moderate your views? How do you become a more progressive party if your entire base is essentially former Confederate slave states? What incentive does the average GOP politician have to embrace African Americans more, to be a little bit more open, to be a little bit more understanding? What incentive do they have if their base is in Alabama and in Mississippi and in Texas, and their primary processes are filled essentially with angry white men and women? How can they moderate? They have no mechanism right now to do so. So for me, I see this getting much worse before it gets better. I think that this event is really going to show what modern conservatism is all about, what the modern GOP is all about. Like I said earlier, you've seen prominent conservatives come out and criticize Donald Trump's statements, but they actually haven't criticized him. As I record this part of the podcast, it's actually 24 hours after Donald Trump said what he said. Like I said, I still think that for all the hand-wringing that the conservative movement and the GOP are making right now, that it's all for show, that they just want this to blow over.